welcome to Dokupied, podcast about anime, manga, light novels, and industry news. I'm your host, Brandon, otherwise known as DocPay, and let's jump right into the news roundup for this episode. Couple new anime announcements, pretty exciting. So I'm a Spider, So What will be airing in January of 2021, so that's been delayed from sometime in 2020. I don't think they had a firm season announced yet, but we have one now, and it is now next year in January. Not that big a deal, though. They also confirmed it will be running for 2 cours, or 6 months, so that's great news for fans. That's one light novel series that I have yet to start reading. It's on my list, and I'm pretty interested in it, and with the anime coming at the start of next year, I'll probably honestly just wait, watch the show, see how much I like it, and then jump into the novels if it ends up being something I'm really invested or interested in. I've done that with a number of things, or adaptations of novels that I knew have upcoming anime that I'm like either not sure about or simply just haven't gotten around to starting yet, and this is the latter case, obviously. So we shall see. I've heard really good things in general, so I expect it's something that I'll watch probably the first couple episodes and then just dive into the novels and binge read them, but that's just based on something I've done several times now. Anyway, moving on, we got a couple other announcements. The World Ends With You, it's an RPG, will be getting an anime series. No other real info about when it will air, but it's getting one. Similarly, the next series, The Dungeon of Black Company, will also be getting a TV anime series now. The announcements keep on coming. My Senpai is Annoying manga series will be getting a TV anime series by Doga Kobo, which is always known for either cute girls doing cute things type series. Well, that's pretty much what they're mainly known for. Slice of life type stuff. So this is right up their alley. Then we had a surprise announcement, which was completely unrelated, or happened during an unrelated stream, but Trigger announced they will be making a cyberpunk series for Netflix in 2022 called Cyberpunk Edge Runners. So that's quite a ways out, and I was watching the Cyberpunk live stream that they were doing, not Trigger, obviously, but CD Projekt Red, and unrelatedly, I start seeing, Imaishi and Trigger staff on the screen, and I'm like, wait, what? This is pretty awesome. Feels right up their alley. It is a long way away, and the game, I think, is now due out in November, if I'm not mistaken. So it definitely feels a wee late to the game, Netflix, but hey, I'll take any more original series that Netflix wants to finance instead of getting their dirty hands all over the seasonal anime stuff. Please finance and pay for and produce any amount of originals that you want. Moving on, we have a couple licensing announcements that happened. G-Kids has confirmed they have licensed Masaki Yuasa's Inu-Oh film, which I believe is set to hit theaters sometime next year. I'm really excited for this film, personally. It's done in collaboration with my absolute favorite manga author, Taiyo Matsumoto, and I love Masaki Yuasa's work. He's probably one of my favorite directors, if not favorite. So when they collaborated for Ping Pong, or rather Ping Pong was an adaptation of Taiyo Matsumoto's work, whatever, when Ping Pong came out, and to this day, it is still one of my favorite anime series. It's so fantastic. And so I cannot wait to see what another work that's touched by 2 of my favorites. So they posted designs from Taiyo Matsumoto recently, and they've done a couple little teasers here and there of stuff, but very excited. And now that G-Kids has properly announced that they've licensed it, we can definitely be sure if the world goes back to normal, or when the world goes back to normal, we'll be able to see it in theaters here, and it'll come out for release in the West. That's awesome. And then just today, both Yen Press and Seven Seas announced a slew of new licenses, a mix of manga and light novels. So I'll start with Yen Press because I think they announced their stuff first. Simply in the order that they were licensed, they picked up the light novel Side Stories, A Certain Magical Index SS. They licensed the manga The White Cat's Revenge as plotted from the Dragon King's Lap. That is a mouthful of a title. The manga version of Wolf and Parchment, and I'm very excited for that as well. I love Spice and Wolf, and I'm very attached in general to that world and characters. So even if I already own the light novels, I own both versions, light novels and manga, for the original Spice and Wolf, and might as well do the same for Wolf and Parchment. Similarly, they announced an art book from Keito Kome, who is the author for the manga version of Spice and Wolf, called the 10th Year Calvados. And that is awesome news. I really want this art book. I own the whole manga series from Keito Kome and a couple other, we'll just say R18 works, because this author is pretty famous for that as well. Regardless, really cool announcement. They also announced the Goblin Slayer Side Story 2, Daikatana. This is a light novel. And the Sword Art Online Project Alicization manga version. Obviously, they'd never leave out any SAO thing at all, so very expected. But I actually really like Alicization in general, and I think it's some of the best work SAO has ever done, or rather, the best SAO has ever been, basically. Aside from maybe like the first half of Aincrad, but I still think it's better. So hey, manga version. That's it for the Yen Press stuff. Seven Seas licensed 3 new, I guess 4 actually, works. The first one, A White Rose in Bloom by Asumiko Nakamura, who also wrote Dokusei. Then Rosie in the Labyrinth by Totsuki Shia, and Muscles Are Better Than Magic, both the light novel and manga versions by Dora Neko, Rilusi, and Koji Onodera. I'm not sure specifically whose works on which version, but that's how they made their announcement. So that's what I'm relaying. Yeah, that's gonna wrap it up for the news roundup. Quite a lot of exciting news. Bunch of new licenses, bunch of new anime announced. Yeah, really a nice bit of news segment. And we have the summer season about to kick off in the next week or two, so that's quite exciting. I might do a wrap-up episode for spring, or maybe talk about my surprise hits, things I enjoyed. I don't know, we'll see. I might do an episode about those soon. I do say that this podcast is about anime, manga, and light novels, and to date I've actually talked about all of them, but let me know what you think. Which medium is your favorite that I cover, or that I talk about? Well, anyway, here is your general spoiler warning. You already know the thing I'm going to be talking about, as usual. But also, as usual, I will not be spoiling any specific major plot points or character developments, but I will be talking in general about the series. So there's your warning. This week's recommendation is a light novel by the name of The Unwanted Undead Adventurer by Yu Okano. The series is published in English by J Novel Club. There are currently 5 volumes out, and the 6th volume is due to release on August 30th. The 5th volume just recently came out at the end of April, I think, and sadly I actually just got around to reading it this weekend. It's not super long, but I had such a backlog of things that I was getting to that it came out at a weird time for me. So I just read it, and that's why I figured, hey, why don't I talk about it? This series was actually, I think, the second series I decided to pick up from J Novel Club and start reading. The first one was If It's For My Daughter, I'd Defeat a Demon Lord. And then the next series of theirs that I decided to jump into was this one, The Unwanted Undead Adventurer. Oh, you know what? Maybe I think maybe the first one I actually read was Clockwork Planet. I was reading the print versions of those that they collabed with Seven Seas on. Maybe that was the first one, technically. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. The point being, this was an early series that I was reading from them, and with the recent volume that just came out, feels like a really good time to talk about it. I think up front, the thing to talk about with this series is the fact that it's definitely not going to be for everyone. I enjoyed this series, and I'm going to explain the reasons I do, but I'm also going to try and talk about the reasons that I frequently see for people who maybe don't forgive it for as much as I do. When I started reading this, the initial concept was pretty unique, and now I think it's still fairly unique for what the story is, but it shares elements with a number of other series that do kind of similar things, except this one has one kind of big difference to what those series do, and I guess I'm kind of talking around it. So this story is a pure fantasy, and that's what I mean by it has kind of a difference between what some of the other similar gimmick stories do. In this case, the main character, Rent, is eaten by a dragon, dies, or thinks he dies, but wakes up as a skeleton, hence the Unwanted Undead Adventurer. He is an adventurer in a fantasy setting where there is magic and all that stuff. They don't necessarily have skills, and it's not necessarily like an RPG. They don't use RPG mechanics. It's not like that. It is simply a fantasy setting, and that's it. So the fact that he dies or thinks he does and is technically or not reincarnated as an undead, in this case he starts off as a skeleton, that is the gimmick I'm referring to. So a couple other series do somewhat similar things, but almost always they are isekai. Something that easily comes to mind is what I talked about last week, is that time I reincarnated as a slime, or a series that I haven't read but talked about just earlier, So I'm a Spider, So What? Series that take a human character and then plop them in as a monster. That's the gimmick I'm referring to. But like I said, in almost all those cases, it is an isekai series. In this case, it's just straight up fantasy. So it is unique in that way. And that's actually what first drew me to the series initially, was the premise and the fact that it was just straight up a fantasy. So on premise alone, I think it's interesting. The world on paper, I wouldn't say is the most interesting. It is somewhat of a standard fantasy world, but as the author builds that out, it's quite different from a lot of other fantasy worlds in the way the mechanics of things work, in the lore and the world building that they do surrounding the dungeons and the monsters, the various religions, the countries. All that stuff is actually quite heavily narrated, I guess, or laid out throughout the novel series so far. So that's one big positive for this series, is that it has a ton of world building and detail. Something that honestly no anime could ever copy. They'd have to cut so much of this out because of the way that this is written. So I guess I'll address that elephant in the room now and talk about the aspect of it that I don't mind, but others definitely seem to. And it's the fact that the main POV character is Rent, and he narrates the story as well. So everything is told from his perspective, aside from, again, some side chapters that are not, but generally the whole story is told from his perspective with his narration. He really likes to monologue in the narration. He does a ton of kind of talking at us, the audience, about the world or reminding himself about things. He very much likes to, in detail, explain everything that's going on. It's definitely a little info dumpy sometimes. They'll introduce a new character or a new faction, or he'll be testing out some magic or something, and then he'll go on a 1-2 page, exposition about whatever it is that's related to that. And so oftentimes you can very much hear the author talking through Rent's narration, wanting to relay all of this world building, all of this lore, all this stuff that the author has thought up and wants to get it in the book somehow, wants the reader to be able to read it. At times it definitely feels like the author wrote up scenarios for an RPG, like D&D or something like that, and has all this background info for characters and monsters and region, stuff that any good GM does, compiles all this stuff ahead of a campaign. One thing I do is I'm currently GMing a campaign for some friends in a different system. It's awesome. It's called The Spire, but I won't get too deep into that. But anyway, yeah, like I have a similar level of detail about stuff that frequently does not get used, but hey, that's the life of a GM. So it feels like this author on occasion is acting like a GM, has all this lore and history and character background and details, and decides, because it is a novel and not a, D&D campaign, that what if I just have our main character narrate and relay that info? So because it is a novel, I don't mind this. I love world building. I love reading about all the weird lore and stuff that the author has thought up. It works for me. But I have seen plenty of comments, we'll say, on, both the J Novel Club forums and other places that have discussed this series, that this series bores them to death. I don't quite have that problem because I find world building and lore and stuff really interesting. I'm the kind of person who, for example, when I play one of my favorite video game series, The Elder Scrolls, when I play those games, I go around, let's say I break into someone's house in one of the games, what's the first thing I go to and try and steal? Their books. I collect the books, I read all the lore, I have a giant library. I mean, that's just what I do. So that's me. I play a video game and then I go and steal books and read lore. I just like to read stuff. So I can totally understand where some people might be coming from, in that Rent has very long-winded monologues and lore dumps, and it can overwhelm people and they just want the plot to move forward. But like I said, I have no qualms with this. So take that as you will. If you aren't a big fan of lots of world building and lore dumps and kind of extended narration, then that is this series. That it may be its most defining feature in terms of the writing. Now, again, I'm not saying all this to try and, turn anyone off to the series, because I like it. I enjoy this series. I'm looking forward to the next volume, and personally, I think this series works really well for me. So like I said, I'm laying all this info out so that you can decide, hey, are these parameters something that would interest me or not? So let's talk about the writing as well. Let's talk about the writing, the plot. Let's get into that. So aside from the fact that Rent has a lot of long-winded narration, lore dumps, stuff like that, the writing is also definitely as if you're reading a lot of lore. I definitely feel like there's a lot more narration than there is dialogue, and I feel like in general, light novels, not always, but a lot of them tend to have a fair amount of dialogue, especially the ratio of dialogue to narration can be quite high for some of these series, whereas I feel like with Unwanted Undead Adventurer, it definitely falls on the narration side. And then there's the story. Of the 5 volumes that are out so far, it is somewhat of a meandering story. There's some overarching plot threads, but there are a lot of closer to the ground plot threads as well. So there's just a lot of stuff that's being set up and a lot of stuff that's kind of going on, and all of it's still basically up in the air. At least, like I said, by the end of volume 5, the author has set up a lot, and it definitely feels like when I get to the end of each volume, I'm like, wait, where's the rest? Because the author stops in really like weird places. Maybe not weird, but like the volumes definitely feel like they stop right in the middle of a story. I'd say most light novel series definitely try and round something off by the end of a volume, whether it's a particular plot thread, some amount of character development, like they round it off in some way, or they move something to the next stage or the next step. This series, I often feel like just stops. Like you're reading it, you're enjoying it, and you feel like, okay, they've been doing some stuff, and like, okay, they're making their way to go do this thing. They've got a little bit of setup to it, and then boom, the volume's over. Like right when they go to start to do something new, it leaves off right there. And you're like, what? Like I felt like I was halfway through a novel. And then I looked and I'm like, oh, that was the last page. So I definitely think there's a little bit of weirdness with how it ends. And I think the series may be better off read in chunks. You'll feel a little bit more satisfied, I think, than waiting volume by volume. Especially because, like I said, the places they cut are just like, okay, off to do this thing, done. And it definitely felt like they spent the whole volume setting up to go do that thing, which, for example, that's what volume 5 is. They're literally, it's an entire volume setting up that they're going to go do a thing. And in this case, it's not really a spoiler, but they're visiting his hometown, Rent's hometown. So they decide to take a trip to his hometown to learn more about him and his past and do some research and stuff. Like I said, I won't get too deep into that, but they're visiting his hometown. And so volume 5, for example, is almost entirely them setting stuff up. They move a couple of additional plot threads and a couple things advance in different ways, but it's just the whole setup for going. They start their trip, they start going, and they basically get there, they kind of arrive at the village, and then boom, that's the end of the volume. Done. And so, at least for me, I looked and said, like, are we sure this isn't half of it? Like, where's the other half? I'm not sure if that's really a negative or a positive, but that is just a feature of the storytelling. So anyway, back to the main point here is that the author sets up a lot of plot threads. There are some overarching ones, the main thrust being the fact that Rent is now undead, and he has to live with that and deal with that. He is researching how to maybe undo it. There's a couple other side characters, main characters, but Rent is the main character, and then the other kind of main cast are his friend Lorraine, who he lives with, members of the guild, or the Adventurers Guild. There's a girl who helps him out in the first volume, a young adventurer named Rena. He ends up meeting someone, and he and Lorraine take her on as a disciple, Elise. Then there's the mysterious Latoul family. So there's a number of, I guess, recurring characters. Oh, there's also his pet Edel. I guess that's all. He's also a character. But yeah, so there's kind of like a core group, and then there's a number of recurring characters that show up when, I guess, their plot threads are being tugged on. There's a number of things that are kind of in the air at any given time in this story. The author has set up a number of mysteries, a number of things that happen in the dungeon, for example, and kind of set something up but doesn't come back to it or hasn't yet. So even 5 volumes in, I wouldn't say that if you're reading this, you're going to get a lot of closure on any of the plot threads very quickly. The series definitely takes its time setting up stuff, progressing it a little bit here and there, and that's just how it is. It can feel a little meandering, where they just kind of zigzag from this plot thread to that plot thread and advance this one a little bit, advance that one a little bit, advance another one a little bit, and then, okay, that's the volume. And it can feel a little kind of like that. Maybe there's not a whole ton of main plot development. And that's one of the other kind of large criticisms aside from the narration, is that people don't feel like there's a lot of plot development. And yeah, I probably sort of agree. Some of the main plot threads, the main thrust of the story, are very slow moving, but I think that's just the nature of the way that the story is being told. So far, I've enjoyed all the plot threads that they're throwing up there. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I'm definitely interested to see where a lot of it goes. So it is kind of hard to judge how well constructed the story is. Like, how good is the plot? Because nothing is resolved. It's all up in the air. There are many plot threads being woven right now, 5 volumes in. I definitely feel like a lot of the things I'm describing may not come off as the greatest to people, but I do want to keep reassuring you that I like this series. It's not my favorite by any means, don't get me wrong. It was an early one that I caught for J-Novel Club. I like the main premise. The characters are interesting, and following Rent trying to get back to being something resembling human, meeting people, helping out at the guild, helping young adventurers, saving them in the dungeon, and in general, the relationship or the core relationship between Rent and Lorraine. So actually, I guess I didn't mention it, but I did say this was a fantasy series, and I wouldn't necessarily say this is an action series. There are fights and they do go into like the dungeon and stuff like that, but this series definitely reads more like a tabletop RPG. There's lots of lore, lots of world building, lots of kind of slice of life doing stuff. They visit a blacksmith a couple times. He goes shopping. He goes on quests. He dungeon dives. So it definitely feels more like a tabletop RPG in the story than it does anything else. Right, so mainly this story it's more slice of life, fantasy. I mean, if I could say a tabletop RPG is a genre, it's not. Like, if that style of storytelling is a genre, then that's what this series is. And there is hints of romance, and specifically between Rent and Lorraine. And then also maybe the girl at the guild. But primarily, Rent and Lorraine live together, they're traveling together, they've known each other for years and years, over a decade. It's not a romance in the traditional sense, but there is romantic tension there. And occasionally, the author kind of talks around it. I'm not sure if that's something that's ever going to particularly progress that far or be any amount of focus for the series, but it is kind of there in the background. One other thing is that the writing doesn't really assume that much familiarity with like tabletop RPGs, but I think it does assume a little bit. Rent does love to monologue and narrates and explains everything. So if you're not someone who's played a tabletop RPG in any way or has a familiarity with fantasy as a genre, kind of surprising if someone like that exists, like if you don't know fantasy, but like Rent will explain everything to you, at least in the context of how that world in particular works. You will never be left in the dark about something to do with the world, unless that is a mystery, and that's the point, but like usually it's pretty clear. I wouldn't necessarily either say that for tabletop RPG fans, this is some kind of like hardcore light novel that only you'll be able to understand. It's not like that. But I think that there's a lot of elements there that you'll recognize and you'll see and you'll enjoy as someone who likes fantasy or that kind of thing. So like I said, there's a number of characters. You have kind of your main two, Rent and Lorraine, and then a slew of, and also Elise now, and you have your slew of recurring side characters that pop up when their plot threads demand it. But overall, it doesn't feel like there's too many characters. I'd say so far, not a whole ton of them are actually getting a lot of development. That is generally reserved for like Rent right now, or Elise maybe. It's mainly for the plots that have advanced and that's generally just been Rent. At least through Volume 5, a lot of what they've done is establish a lot of these characters and their plot threads. Establish what it is that they're doing and what's related to them. So there hasn't been a whole ton of development, primarily just Rent. So I think basically what I'm saying is if you read this series and you start off and you read the first volume, it probably just ends up being whether or not you like Rent. He is, like I said, the main POV character. He narrates everything, and he gets most of the growth and development because that is what the story's about. So it probably really boils down to whether or not you can dig Rent. And I do. I like this series. Like I've said probably way too many times now. I feel like I'm trying to defend it. Anyway, I don't want to ramble on too long here about this series. This is a good place to wrap up now. With 5 volumes out, the 6th coming in August, I think this is a good spot to jump in and read this story. Volume 6 will be them back in Rent's hometown, so it'll actually be a lot of backstory for Rent. And you learn how he got to be who he is and what drives him. And that's one thing I forgot to mention, but Rent as the character, his main goal is becoming this mithril class adventurer, which is the highest level. Or the highest class. It's not a level. There's no levels. It's not like that. But they use this designation for the best of the best adventurers. And that's been his goal from Volume 1. And he's very serious about it. And the problem was he was making no progress and was stuck as a bronze adventurer. And then he got eaten by a dragon, became undead, and now he's made, maybe not in the rankings, but he's been growing and growing in his abilities. And so, like I said, Volume 6 will be getting into his backstory quite a bit. How he became who he is. A lot of the people or characters in the world respect him a lot for a lot of the things he does for people, as Rent. It's clear that, he wants to help out, make sure people don't die, and so he does a lot of kind of behind the scenes kind of work. And that's what this volume will hopefully expand on based on the description. So like I said, this is a really good spot to jump in. You can binge through the first 5 volumes, and you don't have to worry about the kind of somewhat awkward stopping points. Volume 6 is right around the corner. You'll get to learn about his backstory. It's the perfect spot to jump in. Also because I'm talking about it, and there's really no other spot to jump in. You either jump in now, or you're listening to this sometime way in the future, and there's more volumes out, and I'm sure it'll be just as good a time to jump in then. But that's gonna wrap me up. That is The Unwanted Undead Adventurer by Yu Okano, published by J Novel Club, with 5 volumes currently available. The 6th is due out on August 30th. One quick note is that this series, when you buy the premium version through J Novel Club, if you're a member, has a number of short stories that are included in each volume, or at the end of each volume. So I've been buying the premium versions to be able to read those. If you're like me and you want to read all the content you can get your hands on, that's what I recommend doing. Buy the volumes, buy the premium editions directly from J Novel Club to get those exclusive short stories. Definitely worth it. It's cheaper than buying it through any of the other retailers if you're a member. And you get the short stories. Win-win for me. But I'm not here to shill their service or anything. It just works out. So thanks for listening. Follow my Twitter, I am DocPay, for updates. Please, if you like Dokupied, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Let me know what you think. I'll catch you next time.